When the French and British began discussions with how the United States Army would come to Europe, they really wanted replacements. They wanted to put Americans into French and British units. But Newton Baker, Secretary of War, and his commander, John J. Pershing, believed in the rifle. John J. Pershing said the rifle is a distinctly American weapon. So before doughboys would leave, they learned to become riflemen, because only hits count and marksmanship matters. And there's no better proof of that than Alvin York.
You cannot tell of precision shooting World War I without including that fabulous great American hero, Alvin York, another Medal of Honor recipient. However, he was not a sniper. He was a country boy from Northeast Tennessee and had learned to shoot a rifle well because it meant food.
Sergeant York is really the epitome of the American fighting man. He came from a poor background. He only attended little school in his youth, and he really relied on his faith, and in that, his belief in the people in his community.
On June 5th, 1917, Alvin York registered for the draft, as all men between the ages of 21 and 31 were required to do. And he was then ultimately drafted and assigned to G Company of the 328th Infantry Regiment of the 82nd Division. And it was while in training that he filed an initial claim for conscientious objector status, meaning that he didn't want to fight. His initial claim for conscientious objector status was turned down, and he appealed it. That led to this interesting moment before he goes overseas, before he fights, before he becomes a recipient of the Medal of Honor, where Alvin York, he has to weigh the merits of his duties and responsibilities as an American citizen, and he ultimately finds some measure of comfort in the fact that the Bible provided some authority for him to take up arms in combat.
On October 8, 1918, the men of the 328th Infantry Regiment of the 82nd Infantry Division were assigned the objective of moving into this sector of the Argonne Forest to capture Hill 223, right there. In addition to that, they were to overrun and capture the railway line running between the villages of Decauville and the village of Châtel-Chehery, which is just back that way less than a mile. When the attack kicked off, the men advanced into the wooded area, they crossed a stream, and quickly overran an assembly area where a group of German medical orderlies and stretcher bearers were. But while they were accepting their surrender, a German machine gun on top of the hill opened fire. And as this weapon began to sweep the area with accurate machine gun fire, Alvin York took it upon himself to lead an attack out of the situation.
York fell back on what he knew about hunting back in the mountains of eastern Tennessee, where he'd hunted turkeys. He dropped down into a squat position. That's the way he used to look underneath brush at the same eyeball level as turkeys. Not only could he thereby see the Germans, but the Germans could not lower their machine guns to press them sufficiently to hit York, no matter how much they were shooting at him. Well, he used that opportunity whenever the Germans stuck their heads up high to try to see where he was. He headshot them.
At that point, after York knocked out the machine gun with accurate rifle fire, 12 German soldiers who were in this trench conducted a bayonet attack against him. As these 12 men rushed toward him, he drew a model of 1911 .45 caliber self-loading pistol and opened fire on them. In short order, York killed or wounded all of them. After that, York then advanced up here to this road and began delivering accurate rifle fire down the length of the trench. As this was going on in the chaos and din of battle, a German lieutenant by the name of Vollmer rushed up to York and shouted to him, "English!" York said, "No, not English." Vollmer said, "What?" York said, "American." To that, Vollmer replied, "Good Lord, if you won't shoot anymore, I'll make them surrender." And in response to that, York agreed. Vollmer shouted out a command, and the men in this trench dropped their weapons and came out with their hands up.
Colonel Doug Mastriano is a U.S. Army officer, and he made it really his passion to find where the Sergeant York action really occurred. Battlefield archaeology turned up 30-06 U.S. government brass cases down here, and he followed the cases. He continued to find American artifacts in this area where only German artifacts were found. And eventually, under a really nasty bush, he found his first .45 ACP case. Then he found more in a neat little ejection pattern. This is where Sergeant York performed that action.
At the time of his Medal of Honor action in October 1918, Alvin York was not yet a sergeant. We know him famously as Sergeant York, mainly because of the 1941 Gary Cooper motion picture by the name. But at the time of the action, he was just a corporal. He became a household name very quickly at a time when the American nation was paying close, keen attention to things that were happening on the Western Front there during the closing weeks of the First World War. And he was popularized because almost immediately after his Distinguished Service Cross action, which would eventually become a Medal of Honor action, he is promoted to the rank of sergeant. He becomes Sergeant York, and that's how we know him to this day, even though he later goes on to become an officer in the reserves and then the Tennessee State Guard. And York was particularly well known for having modest behaviors, for being someone who aspired to having his own piece of property and to retire in peace and to become a gentleman farmer, which is what he does in the aftermath of the First World War.
70 meters south of me is the spot where a group of 12 Germans charged Alvin York after he had been delivering precision rifle fire on machine gunners on the hill to my left. He learned from hunting ducks and other wild game, you never shoot the first one first. Alvin York drew his 1911 Colt .45 pistol, and as they charged him, he fired back to front. He ticked them off or touched them off, back to front, last man first, so that the first man in the charge didn't know that the others were down. York's actions were called the greatest thing accomplished by any private soldier of all the armies of Europe by Ferdinand Foch, the commander of the armies. Alvin York's tactics against the Germans right here were things that he learned in the hollahs at home.
There's been a long time argument about whether York was using a Springfield or a model 1917 Enfield rifle. Some people argue, well, there were 3 times as many Enfields as Springfields, and he trained with a Springfield in the States, but he got an Enfield when he went to Europe.
Within Sergeant York's unit, the 328th Infantry of the 82nd Division, we know that the Model 1917 rifle had been issued to the men of Sergeant York's regiment. But there are accounts to provide some indication that a possibility exists of Sergeant York using the Model 1903 rifle.
We may never know for sure because there's no record of York's gun. The serial number's out there, but it could be the serial number for an Eddystone just as well as it could be for a Springfield. I remember reading one story where he recounted arriving in New York Harbor after the war, and as he came down with his sea bag and his rifle slung over his shoulder, a naval seaman approached him, gave him a salute, and said, "I'll take your bags and your rifle for you, Sergeant," and did so, and he never saw that Navy sailor again, nor his baggage or his gun. So it was literally stolen right as he set first foot back in the United States. Somebody pinched his all of his belongings and his rifle from him right at the edge of the dock.
So in conversation with the York family, and I've spoken to these men who spent their lives growing up at their, quote, daddy's knee, learning to hunt with him, learning to shoot with him. Andrew York told me his father on that day, October 8th, 1918, used a U.S. model of 1903 Springfield rifle because, in his words, Daddy didn't much cotton peep sights. As a matter of fact, none of the other guns that Alvin York owned had peep sights. He learned to shoot with a Kentucky-style rifle with open sights. I know the 82nd Division was issued U.S. model of 1917 rifles. But the best shot in his company, a man known for his marksmanship, is it possible that he had a model 1903 Springfield? His family sure thinks so. And if you go to the state capitol, on the grounds, Tennessee, in Nashville, you will see a statue of Alvin York. And his family was involved in the creation of that statue. And the mountaineer is standing there with a model of 1903 Springfield.